Welcome to part three of our Contracts 101 series, where we just go through in detail the most common forms used in a typical real estate sale transaction, specifically residential resale. Today, we're going to focus on the exhibits in our fake contract. Our fake contract was between a Sally seller and Joe buyer. And Joe buyer was getting a conventional loan. So we're going to focus a lot on the conventional loan exhibit and talk about how that exhibit is very similar in its structure, especially when it comes to the financing language, to the FHA and VA. And then just because we need to cover it, we're also going to look at the differences, which means we're going to go over the FHA and VA amendatory clauses, aka appraisal contingencies, which have undergone some changes in the requirements as of 2025 that are extremely important. And I think they're also going to be extremely beneficial because I think it's going to help overcome a lot of sellers, the more listing agents especially, understand these changes and how the FHA and VA contingencies in our GAR forms are now going to function very similar to the language in the conventional exhibit. It's going to hopefully overcome a lot of sellers' hesitancy or objection to those types of loans and offers. So let's jump in. First and foremost, out of the gate, we're going to start with page 1 of the conventional loan exhibit. So this is, again, our fake contract on 123 Peachtree Court in Atlanta. And Joe buyer was getting a 95% conventional loan, which means that he is promising to show up at the closing with the remaining 5% that is required to meet the purchase price. And then he's only getting 95% of his the purchase price financed. Now, this financing contingency, which we'll go over in detail in the term on our loan exhibit, we have to remember it doesn't say prove to me you're qualified. It actually says just the opposite. It says prove to me you're declined. So we have to remember that the buyer has to understand two very important things. Not only if they do not apply, which it says right here in paragraph 1 at the top of the form, application buyer shall promptly apply for to seek in good faith to obtain the conventional loan or loans described. The buyer has to understand there's two things that a lender cannot do. One thing, they cannot approve them and get them to a closing table if they never apply. And two, they can't decline them. And so in this particular document, it's saying that the buyer will end up having to prove that they're declined if in fact that ends up being the case in order to protect their earnest money. Another thing I want to point out about this particular exhibit as it relates to the other GAR loan exhibits. So if we were looking at the FHA or the VA or the USDA, those along with this conventional loan exhibit, everything up until you get to the appraisal contingency is almost identical in all of these forms, whereas it's all things financing. And all of those loan exhibits are what we call blended exhibits, meaning they contain two different contingencies in one exhibit document. They contain both the financing contingency as well as a separate appraisal contingency. And those contingencies, like any other right in the contract, they stand on their own 2 feet. So when one expires, that doesn't necessarily have any effect on the other one because they have their own expiration dates that can be put in there. Or in the case of FHA and VA, they don't have an expiration date. The expiration date is the closing date. So just wanted to kind of point that out to you guys that structurally the forms all the way up until you get to the language of appraisal and or a mandatory clause, which is also known as appraisal language in FHA and VA, they are basically going to have the same meat and potatoes language, and the actual financing contingency language itself is the same across the board. Completely separate right from an appraisal contingency. So we know at the top that the buyer is promising to promptly apply, and we're going to make sure that buyer understands that. Also making sure that along the way, while you're talking to your buyer, that you're also having a relationship and building a rapport with whatever lender that they're planning to use, and that you really drill it into their heads. It's extremely important that you, their agent, know what type of loan they intend to apply for, because you have to grab the appropriate loan exhibit and put that in the contract at the time you make the offer. Because even though once you go binding, an amendment can fix anything, I want you guys to remember nobody ever has to sign an amendment. So while it's in theory, a buyer could switch from conventional to FHA, this document says you can't switch loan types unless the seller agrees to that language. And FHA and VA especially require sellers to sign the document that contains the appraisal / amendatory clause language. So it just can't be switched without the seller's signature, or the lender will not lend and the FHA or VA will not insure. So it's extremely important that while the buyer's getting pre-qualified, that they are also really, really, really vetting thoroughly with their lender what type of loan is best for them and what they want to apply for, so that you know which exhibit to grab. In paragraph 1, I just want to clear, we are describing in paragraph 1 the loan amount, the term, the approximately the quoted interest rate that the quoted interest rate that the lender has given the buyer. But don't get too excited about that interest rate and that blank and the fact that it says not greater than blank percent. That does not give the buyer a standalone right to terminate this contract if the rate goes above that. So what that would mean is that if the rate were to go above that percentage, they'd still have to follow all the steps in the financing contingency, and they'd still have to terminate within the financing contingency and provide a loan decline letter. And if the reason that they happen to be declined is because the rate is too high and now they can no longer qualify, then that's fine. But that putting the percentage in that blank absolutely positively does not have its own standalone right to give the buyer a right to terminate if the rate goes above that. I just want to make that super duper clear, and I have confirmed that with the attorneys that write these docs. Okay, so then you have to clarify whether it's a fixed rate, adjustable, or interest only. The vast majority of time, people are doing fixed rates, although, we occasionally see some adjustable rates. For second mortgage loan, I left it blank, but ideally you would, want to put NA in those blanks under second mortgage if there's no second mortgage. Paragraph 2 is where an approved lender would need to be identified. However, I recommend your first course of action, if you're the one writing this offer, send a strong pre-qualification letter with your offer. Do not make that pre-qualification letter an exhibit, but send a strong pre-qualification letter with the offer, because that is customary. While it's not required, there's no language in this document or anywhere that's requiring that. It is smart that you send a strong pre-qualification letter. It definitely helps add legitimacy and what have you to the strength of the buyer's offer. But you do not have to go to the extent of inserting the name of the lender that the buyer is applying with or intending to apply with in paragraph 2. The downside of specifying a particular lender is that they're committed to that lender in the event that they need to get a letter of loan decline or a letter from the lender if a condominium is not qualified, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you put in A, then the buyer can apply for and be declined and provide a lender from, as necessary, from any lender who's licensed to do business in the state of Georgia. So my advice is going to be send a strong letter. Don't mark that it's an exhibit because it doesn't need to be. And it's not ideal for it to be. And put in A in section 2. And don't actually paint the buyer into the corner of having to use that preferred lender, because as fate will have it, once you go under a binding contract, a lot of times the buyer will think they're going to get a fraction of a percent less interest or less fees or less this or less that. And 5 minutes after you're under a binding contract, they're going to switch lenders. And that happens in reality. So if you get pushback on that and the seller counters and wants you to put an approved lender, then my advice is that you put several choices. The top choices the buyer might want to go with, choice A, choice B, choice C, choice D. Explain unapologetically to the other agent why you're putting multiple choices. Explain to the buyer, this is the 4 lenders that you have to choose from, because in the event you are going to need a loan decline letter, or you do need a loan denial about the HOA not being qualified, if this is a condominium, it's got to come from somebody listed here. And so, again, my preference is that you put NA and leave it wide open and let the buyer be able to get that letter or those letters from any lender licensed to do business in Georgia. But if you are pressed to specify, then I would specify multiples and explain to everybody why you're choosing that. Okay, paragraph 3 and 4. Paragraph 3 and 4 are your length of time for the financing contingency in 3 and the appraisal contingency in 4. If we were looking at an FHA or a VA loan exhibit, paragraph 4 would not have any number of days in the blank. The default deadline for the appraisal contingency, it is alive the entire time on an FHA or VA. It doesn't have an expiration. The ones that have expirations are going to be the conventional, the USDA, and the no financing contingency appraisal language. Those 3 appraisal contingencies are all going to work the same and be basically pretty much almost exactly word for word the same. So again, conventional, USDA loan, and no financing contingency exhibit, which has an appraisal contingency in it, all have a prior to closing deadline that you have to specify, which is the term of the appraisal contingency. FHA and VA do not, and their default deadline for those appraisal contingencies is going to be the closing date. And if you amend and extend the closing date on an FHA and a VA, you're extending that contingency as well. Okay, so that's our number of days, but that's not our financing contingency or our appraisal contingency language. That's on the next page. So if the buyer, I mentioned this earlier, it says here in paragraph 5, if the buyer wants to switch loan types, then they must do so with an amendment, and that amendment can state that, or needs to state, like an amendment to agreement, that all parties agree that the blank blank exhibit is hereby removed, and the blank blank exhibit, FHA loan exhibit, for example, is attached here to and made a part of this agreement, and everyone's got to sign off on that. It's not something that the lender can just change loan types and just think that the seller, as long as they can get the loan approved, that everything's fine, because at the end of the day, FHA will not insure a loan if they do not have a seller's signature on their amendatory clause language, also known as their appraisal contingency language. Not to mention the fact that this document here, the buyers agreed that the only way that they can legitimately do that is if the seller agrees. So on every level, again, we have to make sure that the lender's educated on that and that the buyer's educated on that. So let's look at page 2 of the exhibit. We're going to start off looking at the financing contingency at the top. So remember I said earlier in class that our financing contingency doesn't say prove to me you're qualified. It says exactly the opposite. I assume you're qualified, and I assume that if you don't do anything and this financing contingency expires, that you're just going to show up at the closing with the money. Okay, that's basically what this financing contingency says. However, if that's not the case, you do have an opportunity, buyer, to get out of this contract and protect your earnest money within that financing contingency period, but you have to follow 2 steps. Step 1 is that prior to the buyer's financing contingency, which we said in the previous page was 25 days from the binding agreement date, prior to that expiration, you must deliver notice to the seller that the buyer is terminating. That's the F522. It's here in your notes. And by the way, guys, if you want a copy of this presentation with all these notes and everything, It's in the chat. So just open up the chat and save that to your computer because this entire PowerPoint is in the chat. So prior to the expiration of the financing contingency, and remember all our contract days, unless somebody writes a special stip to the contrary, are all counting actual days all through till 11:59 p.m. So if today is my binding agreement date, today is day 0. Tomorrow is day 1. And if I have 25 days, I'm going to count out the 25 days and see where that lands on the calendar. And I'm going to make sure, of course, you never can have a contingency that goes on top of or beyond your agreed upon closing date. If you have that, you have an unenforceable contract. So you've got to really respect the calendar and the timeline. But you want to make sure that when you count out those days on that contingency, that whatever day it lands on the calendar, let's say it lands on April 13th, you're going to want to drill that into the head of your buyer and of the lender and say, listen, I know you're trying like heck to make sure this buyer's approved. This financing contingency doesn't say you have to prove you're approved on that date. It says that's your get out of the contract with no penalty deadline, but I have to know if the buyer's going to be declined. Even if you just tell me verbally, lender, if you just tell me they're not going to be able to qualify, there's no way we can make this closing date. Eventually they'll be able to qualify, but there's no way they can make the timelines in this particular contract. We're not going to be able to do it because they have to go through refiling their tax returns. They have to go through this. They have to go through these transcripts. They have to, pay off a debt and then rescore. And there's just no time. You need to tell the buyer no later than that date that is landing on the calendar so that I can prepare the unilateral notice to terminate, which again is here in your notes. It's the F522 TNR. I need to prepare that and state that the reason that the buyer is terminating is because of their financing contingency, get the buyer to sign it and deliver it before midnight on the last day of the financing contingency. Now, once that is delivered, the next day, and you don't have to worry about once you've delivered it, even if the financing contingency then expires, don't worry about that. You met the requirement. You delivered it before the financing contingency expired. Now you have a new deadline. And the next day after delivering that notice to terminate is when that new deadline starts. It's a 7-day grace period for you to then send a supporting loan decline letter from the buyer's lender explaining the reasons for the decline. So there's 2 steps in this process in order to save the buyer's earnest money. But you've got to educate the lenders. So many lenders, loan officers, etc., they think that they have to have clear to close by the end of the financing contingency. They do not. They think that they're so focused on getting the buyer approved that they fail to realize that we really, really, really need to know if the buyer's in jeopardy of being declined, because that is the information that is going to cause us to have to exercise these buyers' rights. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. So let's say you do step 1 and you send the loan denial, the F522 TNR, then you have a 7-day grace period, which starts the next full day. And then you have a loan denial letter that has to come from the lender. If there was an approved lender mentioned on the front of this document, which I told you guys, I'd prefer you didn't do that and you just put NA so that it could come from any lender that they happen to have applied with. But if there was an approved lender referenced, then the loan denial letter has to come from one of the approved lenders mentioned in section 2 on the previous page. So the loan denial letter then has to be for a legitimate reason. There's what I call the naughty list. If you look down here in paragraph 9, you'll see a highlighted section, and it has little letters highlighted in paragraph 9, A through F. That is a reason that if any of those is the sole reason. Now, if you have one of these reasons plus a legit reason, then the letter is fine. But if you have only one of these reasons listed, then the loan denial letter could be deemed insufficient as a reason to exercise the buyer's rights under the financing contingency, and buyer doesn't have sufficient funds to close. Well, that means they're cash to close. They're getting the 95% financing of the sales price. That other 5%, they've got to be able to prove, and the lender has to be able to vet that they have that other 5% to show up at the closing as cash to close, plus any prepaids, plus any closing costs, plus whatever. Their bank accounts are going to be, and assets are going to be heavily scrutinized to make sure that they actually have those funds. If they don't, and the lender sends a loan denial letter that says they have insufficient funds to close, that's not a legitimate reason for a decline, and the buyer's actually in default. It goes on to list things like if they had another house to sell and they couldn't qualify unless that house sold, they had to have the sale or lease contingency of their home exhibit attached to this contract in addition to the financing contingency / loan exhibit. So that's the naughty list. So I just wanted to point that out to you guys because those two kind of go hand in hand. Now let's jump back up here to paragraph 8. Paragraph 8 I'm very proud of. I'm very happy about paragraph 8 because paragraph 8 really needed to be put into this exhibit. It's actually in all of our loan exhibits now. It's not in the no financing contingency exhibit, but it is in all of the other GAR loan exhibits. And paragraph 8 is basically saying that if the estate type is a condominium estate and it is determined that that condominium estate does not qualify for the type of financing that is referenced in this loan exhibit, that the buyer has up until the day of closing to get a letter from their lender to state that basically it's not the buyer's fault. The buyer can qualify. Maybe they have excellent income, excellent credit, excellent job, excellent debt to income ratio. They are thumbs up all the way and could qualify for that purchase price all day long, no problem. The reason that this cannot qualify is because of the association not having appropriate insurance. Perhaps they have too many delinquencies in the neighborhood with not enough people paying into their monthly dues, and they have too many people that are too delinquent. That can cause them not to qualify for certain types of financing. Perhaps they have deferred maintenance. Perhaps they do not have enough of a reserve account to handle emergencies. Maybe they have a vacation rental policy that is not in line with the lending guidelines. Maybe they have too big of a ratio of non-owner occupants. All of those things can throw it off. And that information is usually, and it can change at any time. So it could have been okay a month ago, but it could have changed just in the past few weeks. And the way that the lenders find that out is by having the association fill out a condominium questionnaire and sending that back to them. Once they analyze the answers to the questions of the condominium questionnaire, then the lender will then determine, is this association meeting the guidelines for this loan? This is typically not going to be found out until the 11th hour. So I'm so happy that the GAR Forms Committee added this paragraph 8, because what was happening prior to them adding this was you were having a lot of this HOAs, condominiums, etc., not meeting new guidelines requiring insurance requirements, etc. And therefore, this was often discovered at the very 11th hour, and you would have sellers fight and say the buyers should have terminated if they can't get their loan, they should have terminated during the financing contingency. And I was one of the brokers that said the buyer was never declined. Your association was declined. It is your sellers who's unable to, who agreed to this type of financing and is unable to actually have their unit financed that way because of their HOA. And the fact that their HOA can't qualify, and it has absolutely nothing to do with our buyer's ability to qualify. But I will tell you guys, prior to this language coming in, we had buyers wrongfully, in my opinion, wrongfully and needlessly losing their earnest money when it was truly not their fault. So this is now put there as a guideline to say, no, you have up until the day of closing but you have to provide a letter from your lender explaining that the reason for this decline is because of this condominium association not meeting the appropriate criteria. Okay, the use of approved lender. This paragraph 9 ties into paragraph 2 on the front, where I told you guys to put NA. It says that if you identified an approved lender, this is that language that says if you identified an approved lender on paragraph 2 on the front page, that any loan denial letter that is required by paragraph 7 or paragraph 8, the financing contingency or the condominium paragraph, then it has to come from whatever approved lender you identified. So again, remember, paragraph 2 is like the all or nothing paragraph. I prefer that you leave it open for the buyer and you put NA, and then if the buyer switches to another Georgia lender 5 minutes after you go under a binding contract, no worries. It'll be fine. But if you get pushed back, then I want you to put a choice A, a choice B, a choice C, and maybe even a choice D lender, so that at the end of the day, if the buyer needs a letter as required in paragraph 7 or paragraph 8, that they can get it from one of the reference lenders that they applied with in paragraph 2. Okay, paragraphs 10 and 11. Paragraphs 10 and 11 kick in after the financing contingency has expired, assuming the buyer did not exercise their right to terminate based on their financing contingency, which is what we want. We want the buyers to stay under contract. We want these deals to close. We don't want for people to terminate contracts and deals to fall through. So ideally, we want that financing contingency to expire and the buyer not to terminate. That's the way we get to closing tables. But this is a very limited right in paragraph 10 and 11 for sellers. They're not going to know to use it unless you, the seller's agent, helps them know to use it and helps them prepare the docs necessary. What it says is in paragraph 10 that if your financing contingency expired as early as 1 day, but no, it cannot be less than 7 days prior to your closing date. So as long as there's in excess of 7 days prior to closing, but as soon as 1 day after the financing contingency has expired, without the buyer exercising their right to terminate, the seller has the right to send the buyer a notice. The form we use for that, and it's down here in the notes under paragraph 10 and 11, it references, because I put the numbers of the paragraph of the notes the same as the numbers of the paragraph in the contract. And they need to send the F-116 or F-816 notice form, which you would prepare for them, and notify the buyer that they have 7 days to provide a loan commitment letter that states any and all conditions, but at least says that the lender is committed to doing the loan with these following conditions. The buyer then has 7 days from the date you send that notice to deliver that loan commitment letter. If they do not, paragraph 11 says a second notice has to be sent, same form, F-816, and that is a 3-day notice period that notifies the buyer that, hey, basically you defaulted because you did not send the loan commitment letter within 7 days. So now you have 3 additional days to cure that default and send that loan commitment letter. If that 3-day period then passes and you still have time on the calendar prior to closing, that would give the seller a right to then terminate if they wanted to. They're not obligated to, but if they wanted to, they could then terminate the contract due to the buyer's default by not delivering the loan commitment, and they could make a demand for the buyer's earnest money. This right is underutilized by sellers because a lot of their agents simply don't know about it, and so therefore they don't exercise it. It's a proactive thing that you can do when you're representing a seller to try to make the seller feel more reassured and that you're doing proactive things to try to make sure that this is actually going to end up at the closing table, even though it's not a guarantee. And believe me, GAR has put all kinds of language in there saying these loan commitments aren't a guarantee somebody's going to show up at the closing, but this is our best effort to try and reassure you. But those rights are, again, they're there, but they go away if they aren't used. And so if you represent sellers, you need to know about the rights in paragraph 10 and 11, and you need to be assisting your sellers in using those. Okay, here is an example of the termination that is the form used anytime you are trying to help a client or customer exercise a right they have contractually to terminate. So this is our most common termination doc. It's actually a two-part form. It's on one sheet of paper, but it has two parts to it. They are basically two legally separate things drawn out in boxes. The first box says unilateral notice to terminate. It only requires the signature of the party, in this case, the buyer, who's exercising the right to terminate. The second box is an agreement that requires signatures from all parties, and that is an agreement regarding the disbursement of the earnest money. So regardless of the reason for the termination, even if it were due diligence, the bottom agreement regarding the disbursement of the trust funds is required under Georgia law, because you have to have a signed agreement that is separate from the document that created the escrow. The document that created the escrow is the purchase and sale agreement that stated blank holder has blank dollars. And you have to have a separate subsequent agreement signed by all parties regarding the disbursement of the earnest money. If you do not have a separate subsequent agreement signed off by the parties, then the holder has to follow alternate disbursement procedures like making an earnest money decision, interpreting the contract, filing an interpleader lawsuit, and all these other things in order to be able to legally disperse the earnest money. So at the top of this form, I am marking who the party is. I'm identifying, of course, the address and the date that the notice is giving and the binding agreement date of the actual agreement/contract. I'm marking the box that the buyer is the one terminating. I'm marking the reason for the termination, very important, and it's important that that be accurate. If you're ever fuzzy on that and you're not sure about what to write about a reason for termination, you need to definitely check with broker support, because we will definitely help you with that. And then it has to be signed by the party who is actually exercising their right to terminate. This is a doing doc. This does the deed of killing the contract. Now, we do have a mutual termination form in our GAR forms. It's not a doing doc. It's an asking doc. When do you use the mutual termination rather than this doc? When you're asking someone to voluntarily terminate. When the person that you're preparing that termination for doesn't have a contractual right to terminate, but their life circumstance or their circumstances in general are causing them to want to terminate, and they're trying to get the other side to agree to part ways, settle the matter, be done, walk away, get their earnest money refunded or have the earnest money awarded to the seller, whichever the case may be, and walk away with a mutual agreement. It's an asking doc, but it doesn't actually do anything to terminate the contract. That's the F519. You do not use that when you have a right that you're trying to help a buyer exercise, or a seller for that matter. But be very careful when it comes to terminating on sellers' behalf. Sellers have very, very limited rights to terminate within the course of a contract. And most of the time, if a seller has a right to terminate, they only have the right to terminate after first sending a notice to the buyer to cure a particular default. And then only if the buyer doesn't cure that default, then the seller has a right to terminate, and it all has to be done very carefully, step by step. The most common instance where a seller would have a right to terminate would be when the buyer missed the closing date, there was no extension of any kind done, and at least 1 day or more has passed with the closing date passing, the agreed upon closing date passing, and any extension to that closing date passing, with the buyer being unable to close. Then the seller could terminate using this form, stating the reason for termination as buyer failed to close for agreed upon on the agreed upon closing date. And then in the bottom, they could make a demand for the earnest money. That's the most common scenario where sellers have a right to terminate. But a lot of times agents will assume because the buyer had a certain contingency and then the contingency expired that somehow they're in default. No, they're not. Those contingencies were rights that the buyer had to exercise, but if they wanted to let them expire and not do anything, that's their prerogative. At the end of the day, if they show up at the closing with the money, they're certainly not in default. So anytime that you guys are fuzzy on that, that's what we've got broker support for. So again, the termination, this particular one, the F522, by far the most commonly used, is what you use when you are trying to help somebody exercise a right that they have to terminate. And it is a doing doc. The minute it is delivered, it does the deed of terminating the agreement. The bottom portion is where they're asking for their earnest money to be dispersed a certain way. Your client signs it, and then you have to send it, and hopefully the other side will sign it as well. If the other side does not sign it, then the alternate disbursement procedures has to be followed by the holder. Now, remember I said in the financing contingency that there's two steps. There's step one, which is this TNR, the F522 on the left side of the screen, that has to be delivered because believe me, everything in contract world is delivery, delivery, delivery. Dating doesn't matter if delivery doesn't occur. It's all about delivery. Has to be delivered prior to the expiration of the financing contingency. Then there's a 7-day grace period to deliver a supporting loan denial letter. But step one and step two are both essential in order for the buyer to be able to get their earnest money back. So very, very important that we understand that. So now let's look at the third page of our loan exhibit. And this is the conventional appraisal contingency. Now, if you'll remember from the first page, we had 25 days in the blank. That's how long it is. In this particular contingency, it is requiring that the buyer give the seller a cure opportunity to fix the problem of a low appraisal. And the buyer is required, and this has been this way for 20 years. I want to say close to 20 years. It was around 2006, 2007 that this language was created. Prior to that, we had appraisal contingencies that basically said if it appraises, it's contingent upon it appraising at this sales price, and if it appraises low, the buyer can terminate. That's all it said. And this appraisal contingency was complex and challenging to write because what we were doing was trying to write something that required the buyer to give the seller what's known as a cure opportunity to cure the problem of the low appraisal, and then only if the seller wasn't willing to do that, would the buyer then have a right to terminate. This is a two-step process as well. It's a two-step process, but there is no 7-day grace period. So on the front of the exhibit, and just as a reminder, because it's been a minute, I'm going to slip back there and show you. Right here in paragraph 4, on the front of the exhibit, paragraph 4, the length of time for buyer request reduction of sales price based upon low appraisal is 25 days. In the paragraph above, the length of time for the financing contingency is 25 days. I personally like having those be the same number of days. I like to negotiate them as long as I can possibly get by with without going too close to my closing date. Like I want to stay a good 10, 12 days away from the closing date, but it's much longer than due diligence and as long as I can possibly negotiate it. And I like them to be lined up as the same. And the reason for that is if today were my binding agreement date and tomorrow is day one, I'm going to count out those 25 days, see where it lands on the contract, and I'm going to drill that into the head of the loan officer and the buyer that, hey, I need to know by that date on the calendar, which happens to be day 25 on this, I have to not only know if the buyer is not going to be approved so I can initiate a TNR, and protect the earnest money under the financing contingency, and then you can work on the loan decline letter and get it to me within the next 7 days. And as far as appraisal goes, I absolutely have to have a copy of that appraisal by that date, which means lender, you've got to order it, and buyer, you've got to actually pay for it. So you guys need to do your part, because I cannot exercise any rights and assist the buyer with exercising any rights under their appraisal contingency without a full copy of the appraisal in hand prior to that appraisal contingency expiring. So in this case, it says that prior to the expiration of the appraisal contingency, if it appraises low, the buyer has two things they have to do. They have to not only provide the seller with a copy of the low appraisal, that's non-negotiable, a full copy of the full low appraisal, but they also have to provide the seller with the F713 amendment to sales price form. And the lowest amount, you can always agree that you'll cover more money, but my advice is just put the appraised value in there. And then from there, if the parties want to negotiate a higher price, fine. But when you're preparing that doc, put the appraised amount in that blank. And so that is the lowest amount you can put in there. And you're going to present both the F713 amendment to sales price along with a copy of the full appraisal proving that it appraised low. And you're going to present both of those to and by delivery to the agent for the seller or the seller directly, if they're unrepresented. And you're going to present both of those by delivering them prior to the expiration of your appraisal contingency. Then it says here in the form on your right-hand side that the seller has 3 full days after delivery. So if you delivered it today, they have tomorrow, which is Tuesday, they have Wednesday, and they have Thursday. So that's 3 full days all the way through till midnight. And at the end of that 3rd day, either you have a fully executed amendment, even if it got negotiated back and forth and you landed on a different price, you either have a fully executed F713 amendment to sales price, or you don't. If you don't, then the buyer has the following 3 days, day 4, 5, and 6, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, because weekends and holidays count, to terminate using the F522 TNR for the reason of the low appraisal. So the timeline here is very tight, and the seller has 3 full days to try to negotiate, try to accept whatever the amendment that is proposed regarding the low appraisal. It's either fully executed and locked down at the end of that 3rd day, or it's not. If not, buyer has a very limited 3-day window, day 4, 5, or 6, to send a unilateral termination for that reason. Let's look at the forms. And then I'll come back to this. So here is your amendment to the sales price. This is the amendment to the sales price form, F713, and this is what you're going to use. And in the blank, you're going to put the appraised value. You have to send this amendment. You can't just terminate because it appraised low. If you do that, your buyer's immediately in default. Even if the other agent says to you verbally, go ahead and send me the TNR, because I've already talked to my seller. There's no way they're lowering the sales price $20,000. Blah, blah, blah. Please hear me now. Do not break rule number 1. And rule number 1 is don't take advice from other agents. So when another agent tells you to disregard the language in the contract and just do blank because of blank, and they're telling you all this verbally, yet the language in the contract and the language in the exhibit is telling you you have to follow steps. You have to always go with what the contract says, because at the end of the day, if you break rule number 1, and I've seen plenty of agents do it, and the other agent says, just go ahead and terminate, and you did not send this amendment, and you did not follow and wait the 3 days and follow the appropriate steps, when they get that unilateral termination, they can then say, oh, they didn't follow the appropriate steps, and I'm not going to sign off on them getting their earnest money back. And then at the end of the day, when the holder is stuck having to make an interpretation of the contract, it doesn't matter what the agent verbally told you to do. you shouldn't have done it, because now you caused your buyer to be in default. Because at the end of the day, language and emails and text messages between agents is not going to have any authority to bind our parties. It's not going to be anything we can hang our hat on, and it does not give us any right to skip the steps that are actually in the agreed upon contract language. So these are the two things. And again, there's no 7-day grace period here. Both this amendment with the low sales price, along with a full copy of the appraisal report, must be delivered, because delivery is everything in contract world, must be delivered to the seller or seller's representative prior to the expiration of the appraisal contingency. And then the very next day is day one of the 3 full days that the seller has to work out a deal to fully execute and get this amendment completely signed and agreed to with the buyer. If that does not happen, then day 4, 5, or 6 after this has been delivered is the short window for buyer to terminate. So let's look at the FHA and VA language. So, because I told you guys, the loan exhibits are structured almost word for word, and certainly the financing contingency and the condominium paragraph about condominiums having to qualify, all that is identical. Your financing contingency works exactly the same in an FHA. Your condominium paragraph is exactly the same in an FHA or a VA. It's when you get to appraisals that the language is going to change. With FHA and VA, which we'll look at in a second, there is no deadline other than the closing date, because your closing date is your ultimate deadline for everybody to perform. There's no deadline other than the closing date for the appraisal report to come in. So that's very important that we understand that. So we have that alive, and it doesn't matter if the financing contingency was 25 days long, but maybe you have 40 days until closing. So technically your appraisal contingency is alive that whole time. Do you want to wait until the 11th hour to have that appraisal contingency delivered? Absolutely not. Do you want the lender to shake a leg and get that appraisal done as soon as possible? Yes, absolutely. But you just need to understand structurally that that's how long the appraisal contingency is alive. When you're filling out the mandatory clause paragraph, aka appraisal contingency, in the loan exhibit, what you're inserting in that blank is always needing to match up with the sales price on the front of the contract. It says, and this is language that is dictated by HUD. HUD controls FHA. It is expressly agreed that, with notwithstanding any other provision of this agreement, buyers shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein or incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money, deposits, or otherwise, unless buyer has been given, in accordance with HUD FHA requirements, a written statement by FHA, Federal Housing Commissioner, or direct endorsement lender stating forth the appraised value of the property not less than blank. And again, you're going to put the purchase price from the front of the contract. Buyer shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of the appraised value. In other words, if it appraises low and the buyer has the extra cash, they have a right to pay the difference and still close on the property. That is their prerogative. The appraised valuation is arrived at to determine the maximum mortgage the Department of Housing and Urban Development, aka HUD, will insure. HUD does not warrant the value or condition of the property. The purchaser shall satisfy himself or herself that the price and condition of the property are acceptable. That's your standard amendatory clause, aka appraisal language, that is handed down and dictated by HUD, by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now, in addition to that, we have paragraph 14. Paragraph 14 is new as of 2025. We had something similar last year, but paragraph 14 is new as of 2025. And what paragraph 14 does is it says, we respect that. We understand that HUD is not going to insure for any value that's over the, or under the, agreed upon purchase price. However, just giving the buyer a walk, if it appraises low, and not even giving the seller a chance to address that, and try to cure that problem by agreeing to lower the price to that appraised value, seems very one-sided and unfair to sellers. So what they've done here in paragraph 14 is they've created a requirement that is basically identical to the requirement in the conventional appraisal contingency, which requires that the buyer send the amendment to the sales price, the F713, same exact form, along with a copy of the low appraisal, and give the seller that same 3-day period to agree or not, or to try and negotiate or not, a reduction in the sales price and what that particular amount will be. If the seller does not agree, if at the end of the 3 days you do not have a fully executed amendment to the sales price, then the buyer has a 3-day window to terminate. So functionally, this works exactly like the previous conditions that we were talking about in the conventional appraisal contingency, where as soon as you get that low appraisal in, remember, it's alive the entire contract, so you're not worried so much about the deadline of the appraisal contingency because it's tied to the closing date. However, you have to have time to do all this. So as soon as you obtain a copy of that low FHA appraisal, you need to deliver that to the seller along with a copy of the low appraisal along with the F713 amendment, and put the appraised value in there that came in low. And then the seller has 3 days to accept it, reject it, negotiate it, and either you have a fully executed amendment at the end of that time period or you don't. If you don't, the buyer has the following 3 days, day 4, 5, and 6, to terminate and get their earnest money back. What the buyer cannot do anymore is say, oh, it's FHA, it appraised low, I'm out of here. That's the step that they cannot do. They must follow these steps of sending a copy of the appraisal and the amendment, just like you do for conventional. I can see this being a benefit. The more you guys understand that and can explain that to your sellers, it's a benefit because you explain to the sellers, yes, I realize there's this really brutal, tough, alive FHA, VA contingency language with FHA and VA. However, they can't just walk. They have to at least send us an amendment and give us an opportunity to try and negotiate and or agree to the lower appraised value. And they can't just walk if it's an FHA and VA without following these steps. So I can see how this would be helpful for explaining that to sellers and overcoming some of the objections that we often have with sellers wanting to not accept FHA and VA language or VA contingencies. A lot of times the reason that they are nervous about that is because of the tone that their agent has set. And I'm just telling you guys, let's not be afraid of this. The FHA debt to income ratios are more generous. The loan amounts have increased, and it's a really good loan. And you know, you don't need to necessarily shoot it down, and certainly not just because you're afraid it's going to appraise low and somebody's going to walk. Here's the VA. Now, the VA amendatory clause language is also often referred to, particularly by lenders, as an escape clause. That's what it was called for years. GAR calls it an amendatory clause, but most lenders still call it an escape clause. But at the end of the day, it's an appraisal contingency, just like the FHA one that we just read is an appraisal contingency. You'll notice this one does not have a $sign blank in it. It references the purchase price or the sales price. It doesn't actually cause you to have to fill it in, but it references it, and it basically is going to read, for all intents and purposes, the same as the FHA. But let's look at it. It is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this agreement, the buyer shall not incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposits or otherwise be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein if agreement, purchase price, or cost exceed reasonable value of property, that's also known as the appraisal, established by the Veterans Administration. The buyer shall, however, have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of this agreement without regard to the amount of the reasonable value established by VA. In other words, they can pay more if they want to, more than the VA will insure and more than the lender will lend if they want to do so. If buyer elects to complete the purchase in an amount in excess of the reasonable value, aka appraisal, established by the VA, buyer shall pay such excess amount in cash from a source which buyer agrees to disclose to VA and which buyer represents will not be borrowed funds except as approved by VA. While the VA amendatory clause, aka escape clause, specifically has that last line in there, that's the way loans work in general. Buyers have to always be able to source where the money that is their cash to close is coming from and that it's not borrowed. And if it is borrowed, such as a second mortgage, that is known by the primary lender and approved by the primary lender. So that's basic loan 101. Down here in paragraph 14, this is going to read almost identical to the paragraph 14 in the FHA. It says that basically as soon as you get that notice of value, aka appraisal, from a VA, from the lender, and it is low, you deliver a copy of the low appraisal along with that same amendment, the F713 amendment to sales price with that low appraised value in it. Seller has 3 full days after the day you delivered it. So if you delivered it today, tomorrow's day 1, they have 3 full days. And either you have a fully executed F713 amendment to sales price at the end of day 3, or you don't. If you don't, then on day 4, 5, or 6, the buyer has a 3-day window to unilaterally terminate using our F522 TNR. And again, another look, here is the form. This amendment to sales price, F713, is going to be used for all of your loan exhibits. It's going to be used for all appraisal contingencies in the GAR forms. And this is even the one that you would use if you had a no financing contingency exhibit, because the appraisal contingency language in the no financing contingency exhibit is almost word for word the same as it is in a conventional and a USDA loan exhibit. So this is the amendment. And now all of the GAR amendments all require this step of sending this amendment along with a copy of the appraisal, giving the seller the 3 days to try to agree or disagree, fully execute this amendment or not, and then the buyer, day 4, 5, or 6, to terminate if you do not have a fully executed amendment. Any questions before I move on? I'm going to assume that either you guys are just brilliant and already knew all this already, or I must have explained it really, really well. So Catrice, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, if you had a question, that would be great.
Hey, Angie.
Yeah.
So on the FHA contingency where it says number 21, when it speaks to being connected to public sewer,
Right.
with the septic, that one gives me a little heartburn because I'm dealing with that now. And I know it can be wildly expensive. Just
So
as
your
a
first thing, Catrice, before anything else,
Mhm.
and you need to not just trust the MLS, verify whether or not it's already on public sewer. If it is, then the easy thing to do is put NA in those, because it's not applicable. If
Right.
if you're fuzzy about it, then you need to have the seller provide a bill from the water department that shows that they're paying for sewer every month, and go so far as to call the freaking water department and or sewer department to verify that address is being serviced by public sewer. But if you know that and that goes for all of you guys, if you know that it's already if it's on public sewer, NA goes in that blank, or zeros goes in that blank. If not, then you're gonna put whatever nominal amount, it could be $2,000, it could be $5,000 in each of those blanks. Because at the end of the day, Catrice, it's gonna be wildly expensive. It's
Mhm.
also something that's very, very unlikely to happen, and let me tell you why.
Mhm.
Because if it is on septic, and if the county came through and added sewer to the street, they have most likely already put a lien or something on that property and notified that seller 9 ways to Sunday that they are required to connect to it. So
Uh-huh.
the seller has already probably been required to connect to it or suffer some sort of penalty or lien. I don't know if they go so far as connecting it and then putting a lien on the property. I don't know the answer to that, but it's super duper rare that that's going to be the case. But since
Okay.
it's an FHA requirement, it's going to have to be in that exhibit. So don't get too stressed out about the amount you put in there, because at the end of the day, if that 1 in a million circumstance occurs and it turns out the thing is on a septic tank and it's not connected to sewer and sewer is in the street, then whatever that estimate is, should it exceed that amount and the buyer and seller cannot agree as to getting that connected and resolved, the buyer would have a right to terminate
Okay,
and get the
good.
earnest money back.
Yes, yes. And then just a little further up on number 18, repairs required in FHA commitment. I've seen responses where they're trying to put like super low amounts.
The
And we
same thing,
know
it
it
works the
can be
same way.
crazy. Hmm.
No, that works the same way.
Okay.
So it's a hypothetical. You base that, you want to put something there and you want to put that it's the seller that has to pay it.
Hmm.
And in order to go under contract, you want to put something like 500 or 1,000 or whatever. But
Okay.
understand that at the end of the day, it's all about protecting your buyer's earnest money.
Right.
And at the end of the day, nobody knows. It's a big question mark and hypothetical, because the appraiser is not going to look at the house from the perspective of the buyer and sit there and look at all the things that you would find in a private home inspection. Nor
Right.
does that appraiser. I mean, you cannot think that the appraiser is going to find all those things and get caught up in the minutia and the detail like a regular inspector will. They
Hmm.
are very restricted on what they're looking at from the
Hmm.
point of the FHA and VA guidelines. Is there a handrail that doesn't meet code? Is
Yes.
there stairs that doesn't meet code? Is there exposed wood contacting the earth that is a termite problem? Is
Hmm.
there a rickety railing? Is there some missing component to the house that doesn't meet minimal living standards? Is the siding on the house rotting such that the house structure is compromised or the framing is compromised because the structure that is not protected because the siding is rotten? Those are the types of things that they're going to cite. And again, if you put an amount, you're trying to get under contract. And then
Hmm.
at the end of the day, it comes back, the buyer has to provide the seller with an estimate. If the estimate comes in higher than that amount for what is actually referenced in the actual appraisal, and the buyer and seller cannot agree as to who's going to fix it and whether it's going to be fixed, then the buyer would be able to exercise their right to terminate and walk away, and the earnest money would be protected. But it's crucial that you put something in there. Obviously, you're going to put a higher amount if the property's in not great condition.
Hmm.
If the property is in really bad condition, you may have your buyer do a 203K loan and
Yeah.
actually try to do a rehab type loan, and actually your sales price would be lower than the loan amount,
Hmm.
because the buyer would say, I want to be able to finance in $10,000 worth of improvements, and the lender will oversee that and everything else. So, but if the property's in so-so condition, not pristine, but not falling apart, then, it's all relative. You'll ask for more money in cases like that, so you can get closer to whatever the amount would be. But in cases where the house is predominantly in good shape, but the buyer's getting FHA, put something in there. And the
Yeah.
reason is it could give your buyer an out in the event that something is revealed and it can't be agreed upon.
Good. Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anthony, did you have a question?
Thought you said something about Links been in the chat, but I came in late, so I don't see any links.
If you can, in the chat, scroll, I'm scrolling now. And let's see if we
'Cause
can,
I think it's only showing me messages after I joined, so you may
okay,
have already
I
posted it.
see what you're saying. So, I'm having a hard time. I'm gonna ask our assistant who's on this message, I think. I'm trying to copy it. Let me see if I can copy it. I think I can. No, that didn't work.
I see it.
Did it work?
Yeah, Contracts 101 Part 3.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, definitely save that on a computer and make sure that when you're looking at the screen with the sample of the doc, that you're looking at the corresponding notes, because that's really giving you kind of the meat and potatoes that you need to know about that language. Okay, so again, we've pretty much gone over the amendment. This is required every single time. There is no just getting a low appraisal and terminating. That day is gone. Doesn't matter if you have FHA, VA, USDA, no financing contingency, regardless. Low appraisal means send this amendment and send a copy of the appraisal, period. Absolutely required every time. Now, we're going to look at the temporary occupancy agreement, which I'm a big fan of. I recommend this because anytime you've got somebody who's living in their primary residence, they're gonna 99.9% of the time need the money. Not only do they need the money from the sale of their house that they are living in as their primary residence, but they need to know for certain that the buyer that they're under contract with actually closed, or else they would have no reason to move. So I know agents are really worried and say, oh gosh, I need to really protect my buyer. So I'm going to put in my offer that the seller will deliver possession upon closing because that's the best thing for my buyer. Well, not necessarily, because we're not talking to the seller. We're not explaining this to the seller. The seller may not realize, and they may not have an agent that is well versed and really understands the magnitude of what the seller's agreeing to by accepting upon closing. That means that they have to be out lock, stock, and barrel, clean, everything gone, no personal property, no nothing, and that they show up at that closing table and hand the buyer the keys the minute that the loan funds. And so many sellers do not understand that, even if they do have a good agent that's trying to explain it to them. But a lot of times they don't have a good agent that's trying to explain it to them, and they don't understand. And at the 11th hour, a buyer could suddenly not be able to close. It happens by far more often than problems occurring from somebody being allowed to move out for a few days. When you compare the amount of times where someone either isn't able to close at the 11th hour and a seller has either moved out, or someone has agreed to move out and don't, even though they agreed to, and they're not moving out, and the buyer shows up to do the final walkthrough and the seller's halfway in, halfway out, there's crap everywhere, there's boxes everywhere, there's stuff in the garage, blah, blah, blah. When you compare how often those things happen versus how often some kind of problem with a seller releasing possession a couple of days after closing, there is no comparison. The problems that exist are so much bigger for incidents where sellers have agreed to be completely out and either can't or won't leave in time because they did not understand the gravity of what they agreed to. Okay, so I'm a big I I like to set out realistic expectations. I like to prepare people. I think it's important that we prepare our clients and understand that if a human being's got all that money and equity tied up in that house, they need to be gosh darn sure that it's going to close. And they need to also have that money so that they have a place to move and the ability to financially afford the next place to move. So I am a big believer in this temporary occupancy agreement. So if you were looking at our purchase and sale sample that we went over last week, I had put the same language because it's formatted exactly the same as it is here in this temporary occupancy agreement in paragraph 1, that the seller had 2 days after closing at 12 o'clock to maintain possession. We're going to format it here in this exhibit exactly the same. And this exhibit is going to be mentioned and referenced in the body of our contract in the exhibit section, and it's a part of the agreement. So if today was my closing date, tomorrow is day 1, the next day is day 2. So tomorrow's Tuesday, the next day would be day 2, and that's Wednesday, and the seller would have to be out no later than 12 p.m. noon on Tuesday, or excuse me, Wednesday. So today is Monday, it's the closing date. Tomorrow's day 1, Wednesday's day 2, they've got to be out by 12. So there is language. You do not need to write special steps to try and make perfect language, because remember, special steps override exhibit language. And I can guarantee you that you attempting to write language to protect somebody could cause the contract to lack mutuality. And if anything, the most common thing that you could do is you could narrow somebody's rights rather than expand upon them. Do not write special steps simply to reiterate language that's already there, that has been very carefully, thoughtfully written out specifically to add the broad sweeping protections that it's intended to add. So number 2 on this exhibit says that the parties, this agreement, which survives closing, by the way, is between the buyer and the seller. And the agents aren't a party to it. It's between the buyer and the seller. And that they need to exchange each other's contact information. And that at the time of closing, when that buyer buys that house, the seller is supposed to give them a set of keys and openers, et cetera, for the property that they now own. Now, of course, the seller's maintaining possession for the agreed upon period, so the seller has whatever other additional set of keys. And at the time that they deliver possession, they have to give them the remaining set of keys. But they do have to give them a set of keys to the property that they now own, and any openers, et cetera, codes, et cetera, because they are now the owner. And they should absolutely be exchanging each other's emails and phone numbers, because this is their agreement. The seller also is going to be maintaining the utilities in their name. They will not make any improvements to the property or make any changes or any substantive changes to the property unless the parties have specifically agreed to do so. They also are going to hold everybody harmless. Everybody's got to hold harmless in there. They're going to be liable. The seller is going to be liable for any damages that are done during their time period while they're maintaining possession, including damages that are created by their invitees, such as their movers. So when they move out, and if the wall gets scuffed up, or if something gets damaged and a piece of door frame gets torn off, or something gets broken, then while we're not going to be the one enforcing it, we're not a judge, we're not an attorney, we're not going to act in that capacity. The seller would be legally responsible, and if the buyer had to take them to small claims court to try to hold them accountable, but nevertheless, it would be a legal issue between buyer and seller. But if there were any damages, there's language in here that says that the seller is responsible for damages that occurred because of their behavior or their invitees' behavior during that possession or occupancy period. It says that the buyer has a right to enter the property upon 24 hours notice to check and see if everything's okay, to inspect the property. etc. But they could also enter the property if there was some sort of a hazardous condition, like they thought the property had a flooding issue, a gas leak, some sort of emergency, someone was in danger. For emergency purposes, they can enter the property. It also says that the buyer has a right to give the seller a notice and come and inspect the property and get measurements done, have a contractor come by and prepare for their upcoming occupancy. One thing the buyer can't do is start renovating it, start tearing up the yard, start doing improvements. All the things that they'd like to do before they move in, they can't just come in and say, I'm just going to go ahead and paint the living room because I want this done before I move in. No, they can't do that. No, you cannot start gutting the ensuite in the main bedroom because you would like to have that done. You have given the seller occupancy rights, and you do not have a right to come in and start doing renovations and improvements while they're in their occupancy period. Okay, unless there was some other agreement that contradicts that, this document does not provide for them to have that right. There is in paragraph 11, it's not rent because there's no language in this that says that the seller is going to pay the buyer rent. Reason for that is your typical owner-occupant type loan with your typical situation on a typical resale, that the buyer is not an investor. They are not allowed to receive rent. They're not investors. They are owner-occupant buyers and borrowers, and so they can't act like a landlord. So they're not allowed to get any rent from the seller, which is why I highly recommend that if you have a seller that needs time to move out, you want to stretch that closing date out as far as possible. And if they need to make sure that the buyer can for sure close, great, no problem. Then you can still use this temporary occupancy, but you want to make it a relatively short period of time, a couple of days, so that they can functionally know, I've got the money's in my account, the buyer for sure performed, the buyer for sure closed, and now I can move out. But if they say, oh, I need 60 days of occupancy, okay, if I'm not able to live there anyway, I, the buyer, am not going to pay you your purchase price 60 days in advance and let you live there for free because I'm not legally allowed to collect rent because my lender won't let me since I don't have an investor loan. So that is not what the language in paragraph 11 is saying. What paragraph 11 is saying is there is a fee in the event, in order to try to be some sort of liquidated damages, there's a fee that the seller would contractually owe the buyer if they don't leave in time. And then it goes on to say, over and above this daily fee that is referenced there in our blank, I have $300. Over and above that, if there's additional fees, such as storage fees for the buyer to have to store their personal belongings, additional fees for their movers for changing their moving date, hotel fees or fees for them to rent a place to stay while they can't move in their house, whatever, including attorney's fees if they have to take them to court, that the buyer has a right to pursue all of those fees over and above this holdover amount. The holdover amount, the way that you calculate that, the best way to calculate it, you don't want to put some obnoxious amount in there that is really over the top, because a judge at the end of the day will not award an it must be reasonable. And a good way to determine the calculation of what is reasonable is for the new mortgage payment amount of the buyer to be divided by 30. And then that tells you approximately a value for a daily rate of what it costs to live there. Then you take that daily rate and mark it up by 50%. So if my new mortgage payment ended up being however many thousands of dollars a month, you know, whatever, 3,000, whatever. Nobody check my math on this, please. And we divided that by 30, which is an average time frame for a month. And we came up with a daily rate, and the daily rate was $200 a day. We would then mark that up by 50%, and we come up with $300, which is what I did here. That's a good way to come up with a fair, reasonable calculation that if it were to go to court and the buyer is trying to seek that type of monetary damage, they have some hope of actually getting that daily amount awarded. And then, of course, if they could prove they had over and above additional damages for storage, for moving, for hotel or Airbnb or whatever, then they take all of that to the judge and the judge could keep going from there. It says here on the second page that this is going to survive closing. That is absolutely true. And then it says that the parties are agreeing that prior to entering into this agreement, that they have been advised to seek legal advice. Now, there's always the issue that pops up. What if there's damages? What if my buyer, what happens if there's damages and the seller does this and blah, 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 blah. And can't we get the attorney to escrow some money and blah, 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 and hold the escrow? First of all, no escrow can be held without the lender, if there is one, agreeing to it. And secondly, closing attorneys are not property managers, and they will hold escrow for certain things like repairs that have to be done or improvements that were agreed to be done by a seller, and they simply cannot be done until after closing, but the lender is going to oversee to make sure the repairs are done. The closing attorney who represents the lender will oversee that those repairs are done. And then once the appraiser comes back out and verifies that the repairs were done, then the closing attorney can disperse the funds to the vendor, and all that has to be approved. That is pretty rare these days. It's complicated. It's not easy to get lenders to approve that. Certain loan types, you can forget it. It's not going to be approved. What you're looking at here with hypothetical, possible, maybe damages, where a seller who's maintaining possession might somehow default on this agreement and stay too long, or they might cause some sort of damage themselves or their movers, whatever. And they might maybe owe the buyer some liquidated damages / money. That's a security deposit. And in if you look here in the paragraph, I have given you guys the preferred language. This is from the GAR Special Stipulations Collection, which you can find when you look in the GAR forms and do a search for 2025 special stipulations. There's hundreds of them. This is probably under the category of miscellaneous, but they're easy to find. They're broken up into categories. You don't have to actually reference where I have here in blue. That's for your benefit. You don't actually have to reference the SS or the specialist stip number or the title of it. You just need the actual language. But what this is it's an agreement where the actual seller pays an actual security deposit at closing directly to the buyer. The buyer holds that just like a regular individual landlord who's not a licensee would hold a security deposit for a tenant. And then whenever possession is delivered, they do a final walkthrough and they determine is the seller entitled to a full refund of this security deposit, or is am I the holder, the buyer, deducting from this security deposit certain amounts for damages that were caused, or for the seller staying an extra day, or whatever. That is a legal issue between the two of them. If it becomes a dispute and it becomes a fight, then they each need to settle it themselves in small claims court, or they need to hire attorneys to help them settle it. What can't happen is the agents acting as an intermediary whenever there's a problem with these temporary occupancies. Are they going to call you? Yes, they will. They'll call you every single time. And you're going to call us and we're going to tell you what to say to them. We're going to be very compassionate. We're going to try to explain to them which direction to go, but we will help arm you with the appropriate response when you get those types of calls from someone who's upset about something that's happening after closing or their agent. We will help you with that. So you just want to reach out to broker support. But I just want you to understand legally, this thing is an agreement between buyer and seller, and we're not their attorneys. and we can't attempt to negotiate a legal settlement between a buyer and seller, our job as a real estate salesperson is over on the day of closing. And while we can be courteous and take their calls and be compassionate, when it comes to trying to negotiate a legal settlement over monetary damages, that would be us practicing law, which we're not going to do. Okay, any questions about this before we wrap up? No? Okay. Don't see any hands.
I have a question. I was unable to grab that file for some reason. I sent you a chat message asking if you could email it to me. I don't know why I couldn't do it. But I
Okay,
tried, you know.
okay. Let's see, hold on a second. Okay, Charles, I will copy your email. It's Charles, right?
Yes, yes.
I will email that to you. Charles Murdoch, I will email that to you as soon as we finish class.
Thank you so very much. What a great class. Thank you
Oh,
so
thank you
very
so much. Thank you, guys. And I just want to remind you, broker at heartatl.com. That gets me and it gets Tom, and we are very obsessive about answering those questions and answering them quickly. So never hesitate. You can reach us anytime. Plus, you can always email us directly. Angie at heartofatlantagroup.com, Tom Fulkerson at kw.com. But when you email broker at heartatl.com, we are alerted. We get alerts on our phone. We get alerts in our email. We know that you guys are asking for something, and we can continue answering, and we can send follow-up questions and follow-up answers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So never hesitate to ask a question. There is never a stupid question. There's simply something that you need assurance about, you need clarity on, you need information, and that is literally what we're here for. Everybody have a fabulous day, and I appreciate you all coming.
much. And we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.